What if the Second World War could have been stopped at any one of a dozen different moments? What if a single art school acceptance in Vienna, a different bullet in the trenches of the Western Front, or one spine in a Munich courtroom had changed the course of the 20th century forever? The question haunts historians to this day because the path from a defeated, humiliated Germany in 1918 to the most destructive war in human history was not inevitable. It was built step by step, decision by decision, through a chain of events so extraordinary that if you were to describe it as fiction, no publisher would believe it. In this video, we are going to trace that chain link by link from the smoking ruins of the First World War all the way to the dawn of September 1st, 1939, the day German tanks crossed into Poland and the world was plunged into 6 years of catastrophe. We will reveal the secret meetings, the backroom deals, the moments of catastrophic misjudgment, and the individual decisions made by dozens of politicians, generals, and ordinary people that together created Adolf Hitler's rise to absolute power and, ultimately, the opening of the Second World War. So without further ado, let us begin at the beginning, not with Hitler, but with the world he was born into, and the catastrophe that would make everything that followed possible. To understand how Adolf Hitler rose from obscurity to become the dictator of Germany, you first have to understand the world he stepped into after the First World War ended. It is impossible to overstate how completely and utterly the Great War shattered the old European order. For 4 years, between 1914 and 1918, the major powers of Europe had thrown their entire populations, economies, and moral energies into a conflict of unprecedented industrial slaughter. When the fighting finally stopped on November 11, 1918, roughly 17 million people were dead, another 20 million were wounded, and an entire generation had been psychologically mutilated by what they had experienced in the trenches. In Germany, the shock was particularly acute because the German army had never actually been defeated on the battlefield in the traditional sense. German soldiers were still fighting on French and Belgian soil when the armistice was signed. They had not retreated to the Rhine, let alone to Germany itself. And yet, suddenly, without any dramatic collapse visible to the troops in the field, the war was simply over. Germany had surrendered. For millions of German veterans, this made no psychological sense whatsoever, and into that vacuum of confusion, a poisonous explanation began to circulate with terrifying speed. The explanation was called the Dolchstoßlegende, which translates as the stab-in-the-back myth, and it would prove to be one of the most destructive political fabrications in history. The argument went like this. The German army had not lost the war. The German army had been winning the war, or at least fighting it to a stalemate, when traitors on the home front, socialists, communists, and above all Jews, had stabbed the brave soldiers in the back by undermining morale, encouraging defeatism, and ultimately engineering Germany's capitulation. The myth was completely false. Germany had lost the war for concrete military and economic reasons. The Allied naval blockade had strangled Germany's economy. American troops had poured into France in enormous numbers, tipping the balance irrevocably against Germany, and the great German offensives of spring 1918 had burned through the army's last reserves of trained men and left it incapable of sustained defense. Germany's military leadership, men like Generals Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, knew the war was lost. They had told the Kaiser so themselves, but admitting this publicly was uncomfortable, and so the stab-in-the-back story was born, initially promoted by Ludendorff himself as a way to deflect blame from the generals who had actually commanded the losing campaigns. For the far right, the myth became holy scripture. And for a young Austrian-born corporal named Adolf Hitler, lying in a military hospital at Pasewalk, temporarily blinded by a British gas attack in October 1918, it became the organising fury of his entire political existence. He would later write that on learning of Germany's defeat, he had wept for the first time since the death of his mother. He had decided, lying in that hospital bed, that he would enter politics. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn, right on the border between Austria and Bavaria. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official of illegitimate birth who had worked his way up through the civil service with considerable determination. Alois was a stern, domineering man who had already been married twice before and was 19 years older than Hitler's mother, Clara Pölzl, whom he had met when she came to work in his household. The relationship between young Adolf and his father was tense and frequently explosive. Alois had hoped his son would follow him into the civil service, but Adolf had other ideas. He dreamed of being an artist. The family moved several times during Hitler's childhood, eventually settling in Linz, the capital of Upper Austria, where Adolf attended secondary school with mediocre results. He showed some talent for drawing and watercolour painting, but he was also lazy, arrogant about his abilities, and incapable of accepting criticism. When Alois Hitler died suddenly of a pleural hemorrhage in January 1903, leaving his family with a modest pension, young Adolf found himself free of parental pressure for the first time. He essentially stopped attending school, persuaded his indulgent mother that his health required it, and spent the next years living at home in Linz, reading voraciously, sketching, and nursing grandiose dreams of becoming a great artist or architect. By 1907, Hitler had consumed enough of the family savings that he needed to make something of himself. He packed his belongings and headed to Vienna to apply to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. The Vienna Academy rejection would echo through the rest of the century. Hitler applied twice in 1907 and 1908 and was rejected both times. The admissions committee found his drawings technically competent, but lacking in the human figure work required of a serious artist. They suggested he consider architecture instead, noting some ability in that direction. For a young man of Hitler's immense, brittle ego, the rejection was devastating. He did not tell his mother, who was dying of breast cancer at home in Linz, what had happened. He returned to her briefly, watched her die in December 1907 under the care of a Jewish doctor named Eduard Bloch, to whom Hitler later expressed sincere gratitude, and then retreated to Vienna to begin what would become 5 years of extraordinary poverty, resentment, and ideological formation. Between 1908 and 1913, Hitler lived in Vienna's flophouses and men's hostels, surviving on small inheritances from his parents' and orphans' pension, spending his days in museums and libraries, and his nights in debating rooms and dormitories among the drifters, drunks, petty criminals, and political fanatics that Vienna's underworld contained. He developed skills as a watercolour painter of architectural scenes and postcards, which he sold through intermediaries, just barely keeping himself fed. He avoided steady employment with the same determination most people reserve for finding it, and he read, obsessively and indiscriminately, absorbing the pan-German nationalist pamphlets, the anti-Semitic tabloids, the social Darwinist pseudoscience, and the political rhetoric that circulated freely in the volatile, multi-ethnic cauldron of Habsburg Vienna. In this period, Hitler later claimed, his fundamental worldview was formed. He absorbed extreme German nationalism, a visceral hatred of Marxism and trade unions, deep contempt for parliamentary democracy, and an obsessive, paranoid anti-Semitism that would become the central pillar of his entire ideology. Whether his anti-Semitism was fully formed in Vienna or developed more gradually over the following decade is debated by historians, but what is not debated is that by the time Hitler left Vienna for Munich in May 1913, he was already a deeply radicalized man. He moved to Munich partly to avoid Austrian military service, though after being tracked down and medically examined, he was found unfit anyway due to physical weakness. Munich suited him far better than Vienna. It was a German city, and Hitler identified himself as a German, despite his Austrian birth, with all the passionate nationalism that immigrant identity so often produces. He found cheap rooms and continued his hand-to-mouth existence as a freelance artist. And then, in August 1914, the world changed. War was declared. Hitler was among the thousands who poured into Munich's streets to cheer the news with what he later described as overwhelming joy. He immediately volunteered for the Bavarian army, receiving special permission as an Austrian citizen, and was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, known informally as the List Regiment after its first commanding officer. He would serve in this regiment for almost the entire war, mostly in Flanders and on the Somme, and his service record was by any measure genuinely distinguished. Hitler served as a dispatch runner, an extraordinarily dangerous job that required carrying messages between front-line positions and rear headquarters across open terrain under constant fire. He survived 4 years of this work, an almost miraculous achievement given the casualty rates runners faced. He was wounded twice, first in October 1916 on the Somme, and again in October 1918 by the gas attack that sent him to Pasewalk. He was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in December 1914, and the Iron Cross First Class in August 1918, a decoration rarely given to enlisted men, and one that required nomination by an officer. Hitler treasured this medal for the rest of his life and wore it always. He was a good soldier, serious, devoted to his duties, and apparently almost without personal fear. His comrades found him odd, the man who never talked about women or joked about going home, who spent his spare time sketching, reading, and declaiming passionately about politics to anyone who would listen. But he was dependable and brave. The war gave Hitler the only genuine community he had ever known, and when it ended in November 1918, it was not just Germany's defeat he was mourning, but the loss of the only place where he had ever truly belonged. The Germany that Hitler found himself in after the armistice was almost unrecognizable from the confident, aggressive empire that had marched off to war 4 years earlier. The Kaiser had abdicated, fleeing to exile in the Netherlands. A republic had been proclaimed almost by accident from a window of the Berlin Palace, and the Social Democrats, who had long dominated German left-wing politics, found themselves in power simply because there was no one else willing to take responsibility for the catastrophe. They faced an almost impossible situation. They had inherited a lost war, a collapsing economy, and a population in which returned soldiers mixed uneasily with political radicals of every stripe. In Munich, where Hitler remained stationed waiting for discharge, the chaos was particularly vivid. In November 1918, a radical journalist named Kurt Eisner led a revolution in Bavaria, declaring a republic and forcing the Wittelsbach dynasty from power. Eisner was Jewish, a fact the anti-Semitic right would never let anyone forget. His revolution was short-lived. He was assassinated in February 1919. But in its wake, Bavaria descended into a terrifying period of competing councils, communist attempted takeovers, and right-wing paramilitary violence. A Soviet-style Bavarian Soviet Republic was proclaimed in April 1919, only to be brutally suppressed in May by the Freikorps, private paramilitary forces made up of demobilized soldiers who had nowhere to go and no peace to return to. The street violence of these years, men in uniform fighting each other in the cities of a defeated nation, would prove to be the seedbed from which Nazism grew. Hitler watched all of it. Still technically in the army, he was assigned to work as a political education officer and informant, attending the meetings of the dozens of small political parties that were springing up across Munich's beer halls and back rooms. It was in this capacity, in September 1919, that he attended a meeting of a tiny group called the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the German Workers' Party, founded just months earlier by a locksmith named Anton Drexler and a journalist named Karl Harrer. The meeting of the German Workers' Party that Hitler attended on September 12, 1919, was held in a back room of the Sternecker Bräu Tavern in Munich, and it changed history. There were perhaps 40 people present. Hitler had been sent to observe the group and report back to his army superiors. He was not particularly impressed by what he saw, finding it amateurish and disorganized, but when a speaker made what he considered a foolish argument in favor of Bavarian separatism, Hitler could not contain himself. He stood up and delivered an impromptu rebuttal with such force and fluency that the audience was stunned. He was accustomed to speaking in small, informal settings and had discovered earlier that he had a remarkable natural ability to electrify a crowd. Anton Drexler, the founder, slipped him a copy of his political pamphlet as he left and urged him to come back. Hitler read the pamphlet overnight and found its ideas, pan-German nationalism combined with a vague anti-capitalist rhetoric, broadly aligned with his own. Within a week he had received a postcard informing him he had been accepted as a member of the committee. He almost dismissed it, but something pulled him back. He later wrote that after 2 days of agonized internal debate, he decided to join. It was, he called it, the most decisive resolve of my life. He was right. It was the most consequential decision any individual made in the entire first half of the 20th century. From this acorn, the Second World War would grow. Hitler threw himself into the German Workers' Party with the total commitment of a man who had finally found his purpose. He quickly became its most effective public speaker, drawing larger and larger crowds to its meetings. He also proved himself a surprisingly shrewd political organizer, taking over responsibility for publicity and propaganda with an instinctive genius for the mechanics of mass communication. Within months, he had transformed the party's operations, renting larger and larger venues, designing eye-catching advertising, and filling Munich's beer halls with curious, angry Germans who came to hear the passionate corporal and stayed to become believers. The crowds grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands. In February 1920, Hitler was the main speaker at a mass meeting in the Hofbräuhaus, one of Munich's most famous beer halls, where he unveiled the party's new political programme, the 25 Points, a document that mixed genuine economic grievances with virulent nationalism and anti-Semitism. On the same evening, the party was renamed. It would henceforth be known as the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP for short. The word the world would remember it by was the shortened version of its German name, Nazi. Hitler also began working on the party's visual identity. He designed the party flag himself, the red background with a white circle containing a black swastika, an ancient symbol he had first encountered in Austrian nationalist movements, and which he now made the emblem of his movement. The swastika would become one of the most recognizable and feared symbols in human history. In July 1921, after a brief internal power struggle, Hitler secured for himself the role of party chairman with dictatorial powers, introducing for the first time the title by which he would eventually be known across the world, the Führer, the leader. One of the most important early decisions Hitler made was to create a paramilitary wing for the Nazi Party, and the man he found to build it was exactly the right man for that ruthless task. Ernst Röhm was a professional soldier, a veteran of the Western Front who had been badly disfigured by a bullet through his face, leaving him with a flattened nose and thick scarring that gave him a perpetually pugnacious appearance. He was tough, energetic, politically committed to the radical nationalist cause, and, crucially, well connected in Munich's right-wing military circles, where weapons and training could be obtained. Röhm helped Hitler transform the party's existing gymnastic and security squads into the Sturmabteilung, the Storm Detachment, universally known as the SA, or after their distinctive uniforms, the brown shirts. The SA was organized along military lines, and its purpose was threefold: to protect Nazi meetings from disruption by left-wing opponents, to disrupt the meetings of those opponents with systematic violence, and to project an image of disciplined martial power that would attract the veteran soldiers and young men who missed the camaraderie and purpose of the war years. Röhm recruited aggressively from the Freikorps, those demobilized paramilitary veterans who had been fighting street battles across Germany since 1919, and the SA quickly became a formidable street-fighting force. Its members were not gentlemen. They beat opponents with clubs and fists, disrupted public meetings with calculated violence, and spread a climate of physical intimidation that served the Nazi Party's political purposes with brutal efficiency. By 1922, the SA numbered in the thousands. It would eventually number in the millions, and the question of what to do with it would become one of the most explosive crises of Hitler's early years in power. The economic conditions in Germany between 1921 and 1923 created a perfect climate for political extremism to flourish, and the Nazis exploited every opportunity ruthlessly. Germany's reparations obligations under the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, were enormous. The treaty required Germany to accept full responsibility for causing the war, to hand over territories containing significant German populations to neighbouring states, to reduce its army to just 100,000 men, to surrender its navy and air force, and to pay reparations that were eventually set at the astronomical figure of 132 billion gold marks. Whether these terms were genuinely responsible for Germany's subsequent economic catastrophe is a matter historians debate, but what is beyond argument is that they were perceived in Germany as a humiliating national catastrophe, a diktat or dictated peace, and they gave politicians of every stripe on the right a potent grievance to exploit. In 1923, the crisis reached its peak. Germany fell behind in its reparations payments, and in January of that year, French and Belgian troops marched into the industrial Ruhr region to take payment in coal and goods directly. The German government responded with a policy of passive resistance, urging workers to strike and paying them to do so by printing money. The result was hyperinflation of a scale almost impossible to comprehend today. By November 1923, a single US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Workers were paid twice a day and immediately sent family members to spend the wages before they became worthless within hours. People burned banknotes for heat because the paper was worth more as fuel than as currency. Wheelbarrows full of cash were required to buy groceries. The entire German middle class, people who had saved carefully their whole lives, watched their savings be wiped out to essentially nothing. The psychological scars from the hyperinflation would never fully heal. They created a generation of Germans who feared economic instability above almost anything else, a fear that the Nazis would later exploit with devastating skill. But in 1923, Hitler thought he saw an even more immediate opportunity. By the autumn of 1923, Adolf Hitler was convinced that the moment for action had arrived. Germany was in chaos, the government in Berlin seemed incapable of restoring order or dignity, and the Nazi Party, while still relatively small, had been growing rapidly in Bavaria under the protection of sympathetic local authorities. Hitler was inspired by a dramatic event that had taken place in Italy just the previous year. In October 1922, the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini had organized a march on Rome by his black-shirted followers, and the Italian king, intimidated by the show of force, had invited Mussolini to form a government rather than face civil conflict. Hitler planned to do something similar. He would launch a coup in Munich, capture the Bavarian state government, and then march on Berlin to overthrow the national government in a patriotic revolution. He had secured what he believed was the support of key Bavarian authorities, including the state commissioner Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the commander of the Bavarian army General Otto von Lossow, and the head of the state police Hans Ritter von Seisser. On the evening of November 8, 1923, Hitler struck. Kahr was addressing a large meeting at the Bürgerbräukeler beer hall in Munich. Hitler burst in with 600 armed SA men, fired a pistol shot into the ceiling to get attention, and announced that the national revolution had begun. At gunpoint, he told the assembled Bavarian leaders that they would march with him on Berlin. Initially, the plan seemed to be working. Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser appeared to agree under duress. Hitler, in his excitement, made a catastrophic error of judgment. He released them. Overnight, they changed their minds, contacted the Berlin government, and arranged for police and military units to be prepared to block the Nazis. The following morning, November 9, 1923, Hitler and his followers, roughly 2,000 strong, marched through Munich intending to link up with other units at the Bürgerbräukeler and then advance on the city centre. They were met by a line of state police blocking the Odeonsplatz, a broad square near the centre of the city. Someone fired. Within 60 seconds, 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were dead. Hitler, who was marching arm in arm with the war hero General Erich Ludendorff, fell to the ground, dislocating his shoulder. Ludendorff walked forward through the police line with contemptuous courage and was arrested. Hitler, by contrast, was helped to his feet and bundled into a car by his personal physician. He hid at a sympathizer's house for 2 days before being arrested. The beer hall putsch had failed completely. What happened next surprised everyone, including Hitler. The authorities decided to put him on trial for treason in a Munich courtroom before Bavarian judges who were broadly sympathetic to the nationalist right. Instead of the humiliating political execution of his career that it might have been, the trial became a platform. Hitler used it brilliantly, turning himself from a failed putschist into a national martyr and political visionary. He refused to express remorse. Instead, he made long, eloquent speeches about Germany's humiliation, the treachery of the Weimar government, and his own patriotic mission. The courtroom audiences were often visibly moved. The press coverage was extensive. For the first time, newspapers across Germany, and indeed across the world, were reporting at length on Adolf Hitler and his ideas. He was convicted on April 1, 1924, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, the minimum sentence under the law. The court explicitly praised his patriotic motives. He would serve less than 9 months before being released, but those 9 months would prove to be among the most historically consequential any prisoner has ever spent in any cell. Landsberg prison was comfortable by any reasonable standard. Hitler had a private room, received visits freely from supporters who came bearing gifts, flowers and food, and was treated with considerable deference by the prison staff who broadly agreed with his politics. He spent his days in discussion with fellow prisoners, many of whom were fellow Nazis, and in writing. What he wrote would become one of the most widely read and most widely ignored books of the 20th century. He called it Mein Kampf, My Struggle, and it was part autobiography, part political manifesto, and part extended ideological raving. It is not an easy book to read. Hitler's prose is verbose, repetitive, and frequently confused. But anyone who actually worked through it in the years before Hitler came to power would have found there, laid out in considerable detail, the essential program he intended to pursue. He wrote with complete frankness about his hatred of Jews, whom he depicted as a biological poison corrupting Germany's national body, not a religious or cultural group, but a racial enemy that would have to be dealt with in ways he left deliberately vague, but left no room for optimism. He wrote about the necessity of acquiring Lebensraum, living space, for the German people in the East, meaning primarily the territories of the Soviet Union, which he planned to conquer. He wrote about the inferiority of Slavic peoples, the necessity of destroying Marxism root and branch, and the requirement for a strong leader, a Führer, who would embody the German national will and act without the paralyzing constraints of parliamentary debate. The book was a blueprint. The tragedy of the 1920s is that virtually no one in the corridors of international power took it seriously. Hitler was dismissed as a buffoon, a minor agitator, a temporary phenomenon who would fade once Germany's economic situation stabilized. This was arguably the costliest collective misreading in the history of diplomacy. Released from Landsberg on December 20th, 1924, Hitler emerged to find the political landscape had shifted against him. The worst of the economic crisis was over. The hyperinflation had been ended through a currency reform. American loans under the Dawes Plan were flowing into Germany, and a degree of political stability seemed to be returning. The Nazi Party had performed poorly in elections held while Hitler was in prison, and its leadership had fallen into squabbling factions. Most damagingly, Hitler was forbidden from making public speeches in Bavaria, and later across most of Germany, as authorities correctly identified his public speaking as the party's most potent weapon. For several years, the Nazis were a marginal force in German politics, consistently polling in the low single digits in national elections. But Hitler was not idle. He rebuilt the party with patient, methodical determination, creating a far more sophisticated organizational structure than had existed before the Putsch. He established the Hitler Youth to recruit children, the SS, the Schutzstaffel or Protection Squadron, initially as a small personal bodyguard but destined to grow into something far more powerful and sinister under the leadership of a man named Heinrich Himmler. He recruited gifted propagandist Joseph Goebbels to run the party's communications in northern Germany, a brilliant and ruthless choice that would have enormous consequences. And he maintained his iron grip on the party's direction, crushing any challenge to his authority with a combination of personal charm, political cunning, and when necessary, sheer intimidation. He was building a machine, and he was waiting for his moment. That moment arrived from an unexpected direction in October 1929 when the American stock market collapsed and the Great Depression began to spread across the world like a plague. The impact of the Wall Street crash of October 1929 on Germany was catastrophic and almost immediate. The American loans that had been sustaining Germany's economic recovery under the Dawes Plan were called in as American banks faced their own liquidity crisis. German banks began to fail. German factories began to close. German workers began to lose their jobs by the millions. From a relatively stable unemployment rate of around 1.5 million in 1929, the figure rose to 3 million by 1930, to 5 million by 1931, and to over 6 million, roughly 30% of the entire workforce, by early 1932. These numbers are shocking enough in themselves, but they do not capture the full social horror of what was happening in German cities. The unemployed were not simply people temporarily between jobs, they were people who had lost everything, who lined up for soup kitchens, who watched their children go hungry, who saw the savings and security they had rebuilt since the hyperinflation of 1923 dissolve for the second time in a decade. The psychological damage was immeasurable, and the political implications were seismic. In September 1930, Germany held federal elections. The Nazi Party had been polling around 2 to 3% of the national vote. When the results came in, the country was stunned. The Nazis had received 18.3% of the vote, making them the second largest party in the Reichstag overnight. In just 3 years, while most observers had dismissed them as a fading irrelevance, the Nazis had built a genuine mass movement. The question was no longer whether Hitler was a serious political force. The question was whether Germany's institutions were strong enough to contain him. They were not. And the reasons they were not go deep into the structural failures of the Weimar Republic, Germany's post-war democratic experiment, which had been born in the worst possible circumstances and never fully escaped its birth defects. The Weimar Republic had been established in 1919, named after the city where its constitution was drafted, and from its first days it suffered from a profound legitimacy problem. It had been founded in the wake of military defeat, and in the minds of many Germans on the right it was associated with that defeat. Its founders, men like Friedrich Ebert of the Social Democrats, had signed the armistice and then been forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, earning them the label of the November criminals among their enemies. The stab-in-the-back mythology attached itself to the Republic itself, marking it as the political creation of traitors. Beyond this foundational problem, the Republic suffered from a political system that made stable governance extremely difficult. Its proportional representation electoral system gave representation to dozens of parties, making coalition governments a permanent necessity. These coalitions were inherently fragile, breaking apart over policy disagreements and requiring constant renegotiation. Between 1919 and 1933, Germany had 20 separate governments. No single government lasted more than 2 years. This instability was not just inconvenient, it was politically fatal. Germans who were desperate for strong, decisive leadership looked at the endless negotiations and compromises of Weimar democracy and saw weakness. The Nazis, offering a simple diagnosis, a simple enemy and a simple solution, found their audience among precisely those Germans who had given up on the Republic. By 1932, the Republic's crisis had become acute. Emergency decree after emergency decree was issued under Article 48 of the Constitution, bypassing the Reichstag entirely. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning imposed brutal austerity measures that made the economic situation worse. 2 federal elections were held in 1932 in July and November, and while the Nazis' vote share actually declined slightly in the November election, they remained by far the largest party in the Reichstag. A political deadlock had set in. No government could be formed without either Nazi support or a coalition so broad as to be unworkable. And in this deadlock, a group of conservative politicians, aristocrats and businessmen decided they had found a clever solution. They would bring Hitler into government, controlled, they were certain, by responsible men who would use him as a frontman while they ran the actual business of governing. It was the most spectacular miscalculation in political history. The man at the centre of the scheme to use and control Hitler was Franz von Papen, a charming, aristocratic and almost entirely unscrupulous Catholic politician who had briefly served as Chancellor in 1932 before being replaced. Papen was certain that he was the cleverer man in any room he entered, and his certainty proved catastrophically mistaken when applied to Adolf Hitler. Papen's scheme worked as follows. President Paul von Hindenburg, the ancient field marshal who had commanded Germany's armies in the First World War and who now served as the Republic's elected head of state, deeply distrusted and personally disliked Hitler, referring to him privately and with some contempt as the Bohemian Corporal. Hindenburg had refused even as late as August 1932 to appoint Hitler as Chancellor when it seemed politically obvious. But by January 1933, the political deadlock had become absolute. The current Chancellor, Kurt von Schleicher, had failed to construct a workable governing majority and was about to resign. Papen had been working behind the scenes, meeting secretly with Hitler in the house of a Cologne banker named Kurt von Schröder on January 4, 1933, to propose exactly the arrangement he had in mind. Hitler would be Chancellor, Papen would be Vice-Chancellor, and the cabinet would be filled with conservatives and nationalists who would keep Hitler from doing anything too radical. There would be only 3 Nazis in the cabinet. Hitler himself, Wilhelm Frick as Interior Minister, and Hermann Göring as Minister without portfolio and acting Interior Minister of Prussia. The Conservatives would hold all the key economic and military posts. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg swallowed his personal distaste and appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The ceremony was brief and formal. Hitler shook the old man's hand and bowed slightly. The 85-year-old field marshal, who had once commanded millions and now presided over a republic he had never fully believed in, looked at the former corporal without warmth. Outside, the streets of Berlin were filling. That evening, tens of thousands of uniformed SA and SS men marched by torchlight through the Brandenburg Gate and along the Wilhelmstrasse, past the window of the Chancellery where Hitler stood watching. The torches threw flickering light on the faces below, faces raised in adoration, in ecstatic nationalist fervour. Observers reported that Hitler stood at the window for hours, tears running down his face. The man who had slept in Viennese flofhouses, who had been rejected by art schools, who had fought as a corporal in the trenches, who had failed at a putsch and served time in prison, was now the head of government of one of the most powerful nations on earth. Papen watched the torchlight parade from a window nearby and reportedly said to a companion, "We've hired him." He had never been more wrong. The Conservatives had not hired Hitler, they had freed him. The month that followed January 30th, 1933 saw one of the most rapid and total destructions of a democratic system in modern history, accomplished with a combination of legal manipulation, calculated violence, and manufactured crisis that revealed just how thoroughly Hitler and the Nazis had thought through their seizure of power. They moved with extraordinary speed, exploiting every opening that presented itself and creating openings where none existed. The first great opportunity came less than 4 weeks after Hitler took office on the night of February 27, 1933, when the Reichstag, the German parliament building in the heart of Berlin, burst into flames. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was found inside the burning building, half naked and apparently in a state of excitement, carrying fire-lighting materials. He was arrested immediately. Whether van der Lubbe acted alone, as the subsequent investigation concluded, or whether the Nazis themselves organised the fire and planted him as a convenient scapegoat, is a question historians still debate. What is beyond debate is what happened next. The Nazis announced immediately that the fire was the signal for a communist uprising against the German state. Within hours, Communist Party leaders were being arrested across the country. Hitler met with Hindenburg the following morning, and with the fabricated threat of a communist revolution as his justification, he secured the old president's signature on the Reichstag fire decree, officially the decree of the Reich President for the protection of the people and state. It was one of the most consequential documents in German history. At a single stroke, it suspended the fundamental civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution, including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to privacy in postal and telephone communications, and the right of habeas corpus. It gave the national government the power to take over state governments if necessary. There was no time limit on the decree, no sunset clause, no mechanism for its rescission. In the hands of the Nazis, it became the permanent legal foundation for the police state. Within days, thousands of political opponents, primarily communists and social democrats, had been arrested, many of them taken not to regular prisons but to hastily established concentration camps. Places like Dachau opened just outside Munich on March 22, 1933, where beatings and murder were routine from the very beginning. With their political opposition being rounded up and terrorized, the Nazis turned to securing a more permanent legal basis for their dictatorship. Federal elections had been scheduled for March 5, 1933, and despite the climate of intimidation, the violence, the press restrictions, the organised disruption of opposition meetings, the Nazis received only 43.9% of the vote, not enough for an outright majority. They needed the help of their conservative coalition partners, the German National People's Party, to form a bare working majority in the new Reichstag. But Hitler was not satisfied with a bare majority. He wanted absolute power, and to get it, he needed a two-thirds majority in the Reichstag to pass a constitutional amendment. The amendment he sought was the Enabling Act, officially the law for remedying the distress of the people and the Reich, and it was breathtaking in its ambition. It would grant the cabinet, meaning Hitler, the power to enact laws without Reichstag approval, including laws that departed from the constitution itself, for a period of 4 years. In effect, it would make Hitler a legal dictator. The vote was scheduled for March 23, 1933 at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, where the Reichstag had temporarily relocated after the fire. The atmosphere inside the building was one of barely disguised intimidation. SA and SS men lined the halls and surrounded the building outside. The communist deputies were all under arrest and unable to attend. The Social Democrats came, knowing their votes against would be futile and that they might face violence, and they voted no anyway. All 94 of them who were present. Their leader, Otto Wels, gave a brief, dignified speech explaining their opposition, and Hitler responded with a speech of naked contempt and menace. He told the Social Democrats he did not need their votes and that the era of their persecution was beginning. The Enabling Act passed with 444 votes in favour to 94 against. German democracy had voted itself out of existence. The speed with which Hitler now consolidated his hold over every aspect of German life was dizzying. In the weeks and months that followed the Enabling Act, a process the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, meaning coordination or synchronization, swept through every institution in the country. Trade unions had been one of the pillars of working-class political power, and on May 2, 1933, the Nazis struck them a single blow from which they would never recover. SA and SS men simultaneously raided trade union offices across Germany, seized their funds and records, and arrested their leaders. The unions were dissolved and replaced by the German Labour Front, a Nazi organisation that would theoretically represent workers but in practice eliminated the right to collective bargaining or strike. Political parties other than the Nazis were banned one by one over the following weeks. The Social Democrats were formally outlawed in June 1933, their assets seized and their leaders either arrested or fled into exile. The Catholic Centre Party dissolved itself in July under a combination of pressure and what turned out to be false promises from Hitler that the interests of the Catholic Church would be protected under a new concordat with the Vatican. By July 14, 1933, a law was passed making the Nazi Party the only legal political party in Germany. A country that had been a multi-party democracy in January was a one-party state by July. State governments were brought under central control and replaced with Reich governors appointed by Berlin. The civil service was purged of Jews and political opponents under the law for the restoration of the professional civil service passed on April 7, 1933. Universities were purged of Jewish and politically unreliable professors. The press was brought under Nazi control through the Reich Press Chamber. Culture, music, film, theatre, and literature all had to be approved by Goebbels's Reich Chamber of Culture, with Jews and dissenters excluded from participation. The book burnings of May 10, 1933, when student organisations across Germany burned tens of thousands of books by Jewish, Marxist, and otherwise politically unacceptable authors, were a visible symbol of what was being done to German intellectual life. Heinrich Heine had written in 1820 that where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people also. He proved more prescient than even he could have imagined. One institution remained outside Hitler's complete control in 1933, and that was the German military, the Reichswehr. The officer corps of the old Imperial Army, men trained in a tradition that went back to Frederick the Great, retained a degree of institutional independence and conservative dignity that made them wary of the new regime. They tolerated Hitler and were pleased by his promises of rearmament and restoration of German military power, but they were deeply suspicious of the SA, now a mass organisation of perhaps 3 million men led by Ernst Röhm, who was making no secret of his ambition to replace the professional army with his brown shirts as Germany's primary military force. Röhm envisioned a people's army, revolutionary and national socialist in character, built around the SA, with a professional officer corps absorbed into it in subordinate roles. This was anathema to the Reichswehr generals, and it created a fundamental tension at the heart of the Nazi movement. By early 1934, Hitler faced a genuine choice. He could back Röhm and his vision of a revolutionary SA army, which would secure the loyalty of his oldest comrades but alienate the professional military whose technical expertise he needed for the massive rearmament program he was planning. Or he could back the Reichswehr, crush the SA's ambitions and demonstrate to the generals that he was a responsible partner. He chose the Reichswehr, and the manner in which he made that choice revealed something profound about his character and methods. What happened on the night of June 30, 1934, and the days immediately following is known by several names. The Nazis called it the Röhm Putsch, claiming they had heroically suppressed an attempted coup by the SA. Historians call it the Night of the Long Knives, though in practice it lasted several days. It was, by any honest description, a massacre carried out by a government against its own citizens, including many who had loyally served the Nazi cause for years. The pretext was a supposed SA plot to overthrow Hitler, almost certainly fabricated or grossly exaggerated. The real motives were a mixture of political calculation and personal scores. Hitler flew to Munich in the early hours of June 30th, went personally to a rest room at a resort hotel on the Tegernsee Lake where the SA chief was sleeping, and ordered the wholesale arrest and execution of SA leaders across Germany. Röhm himself was initially imprisoned, then offered a pistol with which to take his own life. He refused, declaring that if he was to die, Adolf Hitler would have to kill him himself. 2 SS officers then entered his cell and shot him dead. In the days of the purge, the SS and Gestapo killed between 85 and perhaps 200 people, by most estimates. Among the dead were not just SA leaders, but also conservatives like former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, who was shot in his home along with his wife, and Gregor Strasser, once Hitler's most powerful rival within the Nazi Party. Pappen's aides were shot, Pappen himself surviving only by luck and the intervention of Göring. A number of Catholic leaders were also killed. The message was unmistakable. This government would murder its critics and former friends without hesitation, without legal process, and without remorse. Hitler then appeared before the Reichstag to explain what had happened, claiming that he had acted as the supreme judge of the German people. The Reichstag gave him a standing ovation. The Night of the Long Knives had 2 immediate political consequences that sealed Hitler's grip on Germany. First, it won the gratitude and loyalty of the Reichswehr. The army's commanders, who had feared the SA's ambitions, were relieved that Hitler had crushed Röhm and grateful for the protection it had provided them. In return, they would shortly demonstrate that gratitude in a way no one could walk back. Second, it paved the way for the final piece of Hitler's power consolidation, which arrived less than 6 weeks later with the death of the man who had been the last real check on Hitler's authority. President Paul von Hindenburg had been in declining health for months, retreating to his estate in East Prussia and increasingly unable to perform the functions of his office. He was 86 years old and dying of lung cancer. On August 2nd, 1934, he died. Within hours before any formal ceremony of succession could take place, a law that had apparently been prepared in advance was announced, combining the offices of President and Chancellor into a single position to be held by Adolf Hitler with the title Führer and Reich Chancellor. The army was immediately required to swear a personal oath of loyalty, not to the German constitution or the German people or the German state, but to Adolf Hitler personally. Soldiers swore to render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people. This oath was not a formality. For many German officers, it was a binding moral commitment that would paralyze their resistance to Hitler's orders for the duration of the regime, even when those orders were clearly criminal. It was among the most strategically clever things Hitler ever did, binding the military to his person rather than to any abstract institutional duty. A plebiscite was held on August 19th, asking the German people to approve the merger of the 2 offices. Approximately 89.9% voted yes. Hitler was now the unchallenged supreme leader of Germany, with no legal limitation on his authority whatsoever. Papen and his conservative friends had wanted to put Hitler in a box. He had escaped the box, eaten his captors, and grown to fill the entire room. The years from 1934 to 1937 saw Hitler pursue a dual strategy of extraordinary effectiveness. Domestically, he oversaw the construction of the totalitarian state while presenting a carefully managed image of moderation and reasonableness to the outside world. Internationally, he pursued a series of carefully calibrated diplomatic moves designed to restore Germany's military power and international position, each one testing the resolve of Britain and France, each one succeeded by retreat when necessary, but kept when possible. The centerpiece of Hitler's domestic and international strategy was rearmament. The Treaty of Versailles had limited Germany to an army of 100,000 men, forbidden it a general staff, forbidden it tanks, military aircraft, submarines, and heavy artillery. Hitler began systematically dismantling these restrictions almost immediately after taking power, initially covertly and then with increasing openness, as he tested the willingness of Britain and France to respond. The army was expanded rapidly in secret, training programs were disguised as civilian activities, aircraft were built under the cover of civilian aviation programs. In March 1935, Hitler made rearmament public, announcing the creation of a new German air force, the Luftwaffe, and the reintroduction of conscription that would build the German army to 36 divisions, roughly 500,000 men. He did this with a bold public justification. He said France had increased its own military service, and Germany could not remain defenseless. The British and French governments protested diplomatically and did nothing militarily. This pattern, Hitler announcing a clear violation of the Versailles Treaty, Britain and France expressing concern, and then no military response being forthcoming, would repeat itself with each successive move he made, teaching him a lesson about the Western democracies that he never forgot. They would not fight. Even as he was rebuilding Germany's military, Hitler was carefully managing his image abroad. He gave interviews to foreign journalists, appeared reasonable and peace-loving, and repeatedly assured the world that all Germany wanted was the revision of Versailles' most egregious injustices and nothing more. He signed a naval agreement with Britain in June 1935 that actually legitimised German naval rearmament by setting a ratio between the British and German fleets, to London's considerable embarrassment later. He signed a non-aggression pact with Poland in January 1934, which surprised observers and seemed to demonstrate a new German moderation. He spoke in public of his admiration for France and his desire for a genuine peace between the two countries. The speeches were effective. A significant faction of British opinion, including some prominent politicians and aristocrats, concluded that Hitler was a reasonable man whose legitimate grievances ought to be addressed, that the Versailles settlement had been too harsh, and that a Germany restored to its proper place in the European order would be a stable and conservative force against the greater danger of Soviet communism. This view, which became associated in Britain with what is usually called the policy of appeasement, was not stupid or cowardly in its origins, even though it became both those things in its later applications. It rested on a genuine desire to avoid another catastrophic European war, and a genuine, if mistaken, belief that Hitler's aims were limited and rational. It was, however, based on a fundamental misreading of Hitler, who had laid out his actual unlimited aims in Mein Kampf with perfect clarity. The appeasers were not reading Mein Kampf, or if they were reading it, they were not believing it. The first great test of Western resolve came on March 7, 1936, when Hitler ordered German troops to march into the Rhineland, the industrial region along Germany's western border that the Versailles Treaty had declared a permanently demilitarized zone. This was not just a legal violation, it was a military gamble of considerable audacity. Hitler later admitted that the 48 hours following the remilitarization were the most nerve-wracking of his life. The German army had orders to retreat immediately if French troops moved to oppose them. The German units entering the Rhineland were small, poorly equipped, and would have been overwhelmed by any serious French military response. The French army was one of the largest in the world. Its commanders looked at the situation and did nothing without a British commitment to joint action. The British government was not prepared to commit to joint action. Its advisers suggested somewhat implausibly that Germany was only moving into its own backyard and that its legal case was arguably defensible. French will without British backing was insufficient. The German troops stayed in the Rhineland. Hitler drew his conclusion. The Western democracies would not fight to enforce Versailles, not for anything short of an outright attack on their own territory. Each subsequent move he made would test that conclusion against increasing stakes. He would win every test until the one that started the war. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was followed by a period of intense diplomatic activity in which Hitler moved to secure Germany's international position and build the alliances he would need for the larger confrontations ahead. The Spanish Civil War, which broke out in July 1936 when Francisco Franco's nationalist forces rose against the elected Republican government, provided Hitler with both a proving ground for German military technology and an opportunity to build relationships with like-minded authoritarian regimes. Germany sent the Condor Legion, an expeditionary air force, to support Franco, and German pilots gained invaluable combat experience over Spain. The bombing of the Basque town of Guernica on April 26, 1937, carried out by the Condor Legion, killed hundreds of civilians and demonstrated to the world the devastating potential of aerial bombardment of undefended cities. Pablo Picasso's famous painting captured the horror for posterity, but the military and political lesson was not lost on anyone paying attention. Nazi Germany was prepared to use its air power without restraint against civilian populations. In October 1936, Germany and Italy signed the Rome-Berlin Axis Agreement, the diplomatic partnership between Hitler and Mussolini that would deepen into the military alliance of the Pact of Steel in 1939. In November 1936, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, officially aimed against Soviet communism, which would eventually form the basis of the Tripartite Pact of 1940 that created the formal Axis alliance. Hitler was building his international position piece by piece, choosing partners who shared his hostility to the existing international order and whose own aggressive ambitions in their respective regions would provide useful distractions for the Western powers. The anti-Semitic persecution that had been building in Germany since 1933 took a significant escalation in September 1935 with the announcement of the Nuremberg Laws at the Nazi Party's annual rally in that city. The two main laws stripped Jews of German citizenship, reducing them to residents of the state without political rights, and criminalized sexual and marital relations between Jews and non-Jews. A supplementary decree attempted to define who was legally Jewish based on grandparental ancestry, a categorization that trapped hundreds of thousands of people who had thought themselves fully assimilated Germans or who had converted to Christianity generations before. The laws were the formal institutionalization of what had already been happening informally. Jews being driven out of professions, businesses, public life, and social contact with non-Jewish Germans through a combination of legal coercion and organized social pressure. Jewish businesses were boycotted, Jewish doctors and lawyers lost their licenses, Jewish children were expelled from German schools and universities, and the regime's propaganda continuously depicted Jews as racial enemies, biological pollutants, and global conspirators behind every German misfortune. The world observed all of this. The 1936 Berlin Olympics briefly distracted international attention, as Hitler carefully managed Germany's public image during the Games, removing the most visible anti-Semitic signs and presenting a welcoming, civilized face to the world's athletes and journalists. Jesse Owens's magnificent 4 gold medals provided a quiet refutation of Nazi racial theories, and Hitler's carefully ambiguous response to Black American athletic success became a minor diplomatic incident. But when the Olympics ended and the cameras went away, the persecution continued and deepened. Inside Hitler's government, the strategic direction was becoming clearer in a way that some of his more perceptive subordinates found alarming. On November 5th, 1937, Hitler summoned his top military and political advisors, including War Minister Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg, Army Commander-in-Chief General Werner von Fritsch, Naval Commander-in-Chief Admiral Erich Raeder, Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief Hermann Göring, and Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath to a secret conference at the Chancellery in Berlin. What Hitler said at that meeting was recorded in a document written up afterward by his military adjutant, Colonel Friedrich Hossbach, and that document has been known to history ever since as the Hossbach Memorandum. In it, Hitler laid out with remarkable candor his actual strategic intentions. He told his assembled commanders that Germany's future depended on acquiring living space in Europe. This space could only be obtained by force, and the question was not whether Germany would use force, but when and how. He spoke of a window of opportunity. German rearmament would reach its peak around 1943 to 1945, after which Germany's relative advantage would begin to decline as other powers caught up. He intended to strike before that window closed. His immediate objectives were Austria and Czechoslovakia, the absorption of which would provide both living space and favourable strategic geography for future operations. He acknowledged the risk of war with Britain and France, but concluded that both countries were unlikely to intervene in Central European affairs with sufficient decisiveness to stop him. Some of his listeners were alarmed. Blomberg and Fritsch expressed doubts about Germany's military readiness for conflict with major powers. Von Neurath was deeply troubled. Within months, all three were removed from their posts. Blomberg and Fritsch in a scandal that was partly manufactured by the SS. Von Neurath replaced as foreign minister by the more pliable Joachim von Ribbentrop. Hitler took direct personal command of the armed forces, creating the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Armed Forces, with himself as commander. The Hossbach Conference had revealed Hitler's actual timeline. The clock was now running. Between the moment Hitler took power and the moment the first shell crossed into Poland, a cast of individuals shaped history in ways that are worth examining more closely. Understanding who these people were and what drove them helps explain how an entire civilization allowed itself to sleepwalk toward catastrophe, and how those who might have stopped it repeatedly chose not to. Among the most consequential figures of this period, aside from Hitler himself, was the man whose economic wizardry made the whole enterprise financially possible. Hjalmar Schacht, Germany's central banker and later economics minister. Schacht was not a Nazi by conviction. He was a brilliant, arrogant, and unprincipled technocrat who saw in the Nazi regime an opportunity to apply his considerable economic skills at a national scale. Born in 1877, Schacht had served as president of the Reichsbank under the Weimar Republic and had actually solved the hyperinflation crisis of 1923 by introducing the Rentenmark. When he returned to the Reichsbank presidency in 1933 at Hitler's invitation, his task was financing the impossible, a massive rearmament program in a country that had no reserves, poor credit internationally, and whose economy was still recovering from the Great Depression. Schacht solved this problem with a series of ingenious financial instruments, most notably the so-called MEFO bills, named after a dummy corporation, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, that issued the bills as a form of short-term government debt that did not appear in the official government accounts. Armaments contractors were paid in MEFO bills, which they could hold or rediscount at the Reichsbank. Through this mechanism, Schacht financed billions of Reichsmarks worth of military spending without triggering the inflation that would have resulted from simply printing money. Between 1933 and 1938, German military expenditure increased by a factor of roughly 16, from approximately 1.9 billion Reichsmarks in 1933 to approximately 18 billion in 1938. Without Schacht's financial engineering, this rearmament at this speed would have been impossible. He eventually fell out with Hitler and Göring over the pace of spending and resigned in 1937, though he remained sufficiently associated with the regime to be tried at Nuremberg, where he was ultimately acquitted. His contribution to enabling Hitler's war machine is, however, not in historical doubt. The man perhaps most responsible for shaping the image that allowed Hitler to fool so many people for so long was Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Goebbels was born in Reit in the Rhineland in 1897, the son of a factory foreman, and he overcame a childhood disability, a deformed right foot caused by a bone disease, with a ferocious intellectual energy that took him through university to a doctorate in literature. He had wanted to be a writer and had written a semi-autobiographical novel that no publisher would accept. He joined the Nazi Party in 1924 and came to Hitler's attention through his work organizing the party in northern Germany, where he built a formidable regional organization out of nothing. Hitler appointed him to run the party's propaganda apparatus in 1928, and after 1933, Goebbels became the master of an entire nation's information environment. His genius was for simplification and repetition. He understood with painful clarity that most people do not analyze political messages in detail. They absorb them emotionally and through constant repetition. He controlled German radio, which brought Hitler's voice directly into German homes. He controlled the press through the Reich press chamber. He organized the spectacular public rallies, the torchlight parades, the choreographed displays of national community that made the Nazi movement feel like a historical destiny rather than a political party. The annual Nuremberg rallies, held every September, were productions of extraordinary theatrical power, designed by Albert Speer with massive architectural backdrops, massed formations of uniformed men, banks of searchlights turned on the night sky. They were intended to overwhelm the individual sense of self and merge it into a collective national identity that was inseparable from Hitler. Goebbels was cynical about the public he manipulated, but his cynicism was not simple contempt. He genuinely believed in the Nazi ideology, if in a more sophisticated form than many of his colleagues. He would remain loyal to Hitler until the very end, writing propaganda until the Red Army was blocks from the Chancellery, and finally killing his 6 children and then himself with his wife Magda in the Führerbunker on May 1st, 1945. His diary, kept throughout the Nazi period, is one of the most chilling and illuminating documents the era produced. Hermann Göring was the third of Hitler's inner circle, whose role in the path to war demands attention. Göring was a genuine war hero of the First World War, the last commander of the famous Richthofen fighter squadron, who had received Germany's highest military decoration, the Pour le Mérite, and shot down 22 Allied aircraft. He was physically imposing, personally charming when he chose to be, deeply corrupt, and politically ruthless in the service of Hitler and himself, in approximately that order of priority. He joined the Nazi Party in 1922 and became one of its most publicly recognizable figures. After the beer hall putsch, in which he was shot in the groin and nearly died, he fled to Austria and Italy and became addicted to morphine during his recovery. He returned to Germany in 1927 after an amnesty, his addiction managed if never cured, and won election to the Reichstag in 1928. After January 1933, Göring accumulated positions with the obsessive energy of a collector. He became Minister-President of Prussia, taking control of Germany's largest state and its police force, which he turned into an instrument of political terror. He created the Gestapo, the secret police, originally as a Prussian institution before handing it to Himmler. He became Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, building the German Air Force from nothing to the largest in Europe within 5 years. He was Hitler's designated successor, and he was enriching himself on a Baroque scale, stealing art collections confiscated from Jewish owners, accepting estates and hunting grounds as gifts. Dressing in uniforms, he designed himself with medals and decorations that struck foreign visitors as more theatrical than military. His villa at Carinhall, named after his first wife who had died of epilepsy in 1931, was filled with looted masterpieces. His role in the path to war was primarily as the builder of the Luftwaffe, which gave Hitler the air power that made his military threats credible and his campaigns viable, and as one of the constant voices urging Hitler to act rather than negotiate. It was Göring who most enthusiastically planned the aerial bombardment of Polish cities that opened the war. He would be tried at Nuremberg after the war, convicted on all 4 counts, and sentenced to hang, but swallowed a cyanide capsule the night before his scheduled execution on October 15, 1946, cheating the gallows in a final act of characteristic defiance. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and later the entire German police apparatus, was in some ways the most sinister figure in Hitler's inner circle, precisely because he was the most ordinary seeming. Born in Munich in 1900, the son of a schoolteacher, Himmler had been too young for the First World War, a gap in his biography that deeply marked his psychology. He joined the Nazi movement in the early 1920s and participated in the beer hall putsch as a flag bearer. He was appointed head of the SS in 1929 when it was a tiny organization of less than 300 men, Hitler's personal bodyguard. Over the following years, Himmler built it into the most powerful institution in Germany outside the Wehrmacht, a state within a state with its own military forces, its own intelligence apparatus, its own economic enterprises, and ultimately, its own extermination program. He was not personally imposing. He wore glasses, had a soft handshake, and discussed the murder of millions in the calm, bureaucratic tone of a man reviewing production statistics. In October 1943, he gave a speech to SS generals at Posen, in which he spoke with extraordinary frankness about the mass murder of Jews being carried out under his direction, describing it as a page of glory in German history that must never be written and never told, but which was being accomplished for the sake of Germany's future. He was the architect of the Holocaust in its organizational and logistical dimensions. His interest in the occult, his enthusiasm for breeding programs, his obsession with racial purity and Germanic heritage gave his evil a peculiarly ideological character that distinguished it from simple criminality. When Germany's defeat became clear in 1945, Himmler attempted to negotiate separately with the Western Allies, believing his offer to end the murder of Jews might be used as a bargaining chip. Hitler learned of this from a BBC broadcast and expelled him from the party in one of his final actions. Himmler tried to flee disguised as a common soldier and was captured by British troops. He bit on a cyanide capsule during a medical examination on May 23, 1945, and died within minutes. The man who held Germany's formal diplomatic portfolio through the most critical years of the pre-war crisis was Joachim von Ribbentrop, who served as foreign minister from 1938 to 1945. Ribbentrop was widely disliked and distrusted even by his Nazi colleagues, who found him vain, pompous, and frequently incompetent. He had made his money in the wine business after the First World War and bought his way into the German aristocracy by the cynical device of getting himself adopted by a distant relative with the coveted von particle before his surname. He cultivated contacts in British high society during the early 1930s and convinced Hitler, incorrectly, that he had deep insight into British thinking. His appointment as ambassador to London in 1936 was a diplomatic embarrassment almost from the first week. He notoriously greeted King George VI with a Nazi salute. As foreign minister, his main achievement was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, negotiated in Moscow in August 1939, which was a genuine diplomatic coup, however morally squalid. He had assured Hitler that Britain would not fight for Poland. When Britain did declare war, Hitler reportedly turned to him and asked that question. What now? With unconcealed anger. Ribbentrop's consistent assurances that the Western powers would not fight had been a significant factor in Hitler's willingness to press to the point of actual conflict. He was tried at Nuremberg and hanged on October 16, 1946, becoming the first of the major war criminals to be executed that morning. His last words, spoken on the scaffold, were that he wished peace for the world. The role of the German military's own professional leadership in enabling Hitler's path to war is one of the most morally complex questions in the entire history of the period. The officers of the German army, the Wehrmacht's senior commanders, were not Nazis in the party political sense. Most of them came from the conservative Prussian military tradition, with its emphasis on professional duty, political abstinence, and loyalty to the state rather than to any particular government. They had sworn their personal oath to Hitler in August 1934, and for most of them, that oath was morally binding in ways that made active resistance extremely difficult to contemplate. A minority did contemplate it. General Ludwig Beck, the Army Chief of Staff, resigned in protest in 1938 over Hitler's war plans, the only senior officer to make such a gesture of principled dissent, and he later became involved in the various plots against Hitler that would culminate in the July 20th, 1944, assassination attempt. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of military intelligence, used his position to obstruct some Nazi operations and protect some individuals from persecution. General Erwin von Witzleben, General Franz Halder, and a number of other officers participated at various levels in conspiracy against the regime. But these were minorities. The majority of German officers, however much they may have personally disliked Hitler or disagreed with specific policies, continued to execute their professional duties with great skill and efficiency, enabling the conquests that Hitler's political and diplomatic maneuvering made possible, and that his generals' military expertise made rapid and devastating in their results. The question of where professional military duty ends and moral complicity begins was one that the Nuremberg trials would attempt to answer, with complicated and contested results. What is not complicated is that without the German army's technical expertise and its generals' willingness to execute Hitler's strategic plans, the campaigns that conquered Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and much of the Soviet Union would not have been possible. The ordinary Germans who supported Hitler through elections and through the social conformity of the Third Reich also deserve some consideration in any accounting of how the Second World War became possible. The Nazi electoral performance from 1930 onward was a genuine popular phenomenon. Millions of Germans voted for Hitler, not because they were peculiarly evil or uniquely susceptible to fascism, but because they were human beings in desperate circumstances, responding to a political movement that offered them simple answers, clear enemies, and the promise of national restoration after years of humiliation and economic suffering. Many of them did not want war. Many of them were uncomfortable with the anti-Semitic violence, even as they shared some of the anti-Semitic prejudices that Nazi propaganda exploited. Many of them looked away from what was being done in their name, practiced the self-protective incuriosity that authoritarian regimes depend on to function. This does not absolve them. Complicity through inaction is still complicity. But understanding it as a human phenomenon rather than a uniquely German one is essential if the lessons of the period are to be applied to any other context. The conditions that made Nazism possible, economic despair, institutional crisis, nationalist resentment, the availability of scapegoats, and the desire for strong leadership, are not unique to Germany in the 1930s. They recur wherever those conditions assemble. The lesson is not that Germans were uniquely susceptible, it is that human beings generally are susceptible under the right conditions to movements that exploit their fears and frustrations, and that the safeguards of democratic governance, free press, independent judiciary and civil society must be defended actively and continuously, or they will not survive the assault that extremism inevitably mounts against them. The physical preparations for the war that began on September 1st, 1939, had been underway for years in the form of Germany's massive rearmament program, and the scale of what had been achieved in 6 years was genuinely extraordinary. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany had essentially no military aircraft, no submarines, no tanks in service, and an army limited by treaty to 100,000 men. By September 1939, the Wehrmacht comprised approximately 3.7 million men organized into 103 divisions. The Luftwaffe had approximately 4,000 operational aircraft, including modern designs like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter and the Heinkel He 111 bomber that were among the best in the world. The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, had 57 submarines under Admiral Dönitz's command, and the two great battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were operational, with more powerful vessels under construction. The Panzerwaffe, Germany's armoured force, had approximately 2,700 tanks, organised in 6 panzer divisions, though many of these were the lighter Panzer I and II models. The industrial base that produced all of this, the Ruhr's steel mills, the factories of Saxony and Bavaria, the shipyards of Hamburg and Kiel, had been working at maximum output for years, sustained by Schacht's financial wizardry and increasingly by the exploitation of resources seized from Austria and Czechoslovakia, the fortifications of the Maginot Line on the western border and the Siegfried Line, or West Wall. Facing it represented the physical geography of the coming conflict. And over all of it, in his mountain retreat at the Berghof above Berchtesgaden, brooded the man who had set it all in motion, studying maps, receiving reports, and moving the pieces of his terrible game toward the moment he had been planning since he lay in that military hospital in Pasewalk in 1918, temporarily blind and burning with the conviction that Germany's defeat would be avenged and that he was the man appointed by fate to avenge it. Whether Adolf Hitler believed himself to be an agent of historical destiny, as his rhetoric endlessly proclaimed, or was merely a calculating opportunist using grandiose language as a political tool, is a question that occupied many who encountered him. Those who met him reported wildly different experiences. Some found him hypnotic, persuasive, even charming in private settings. Others found him terrifying, even in casual conversation, unable to escape the feeling that they were in the presence of something fundamentally dangerous. Foreign dignitaries who came to negotiate with him often left feeling that they had spoken not to a politician, but to someone operating on a completely different plane of reference, someone for whom the ordinary conventions of diplomacy and mutual interest simply did not apply. Neville Chamberlain, meeting him at Berchtesgaden, said afterward that he had the impression of a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word, a judgment so spectacularly wrong that it has haunted his historical reputation ever since. Winston Churchill, who never met Hitler in person, understood him better than those who did, because Churchill read Mein Kampf with careful attention and took it seriously. The lesson is worth remembering. What a man writes about his own intentions, particularly when he writes it with the passion of genuine conviction, is usually more reliable evidence of those intentions than the reassurances he gives to people he is trying to manipulate. In the final days before the war, the ordinary people of Europe were holding their breath. In London, gas masks were being distributed. In Paris, sandbags were going up around public buildings. In Warsaw, citizens were digging air raid shelters in the parks. In Berlin, the official mood was one of determined confidence, though private conversations revealed a more anxious reality. Many ordinary Germans had no desire for another war and remembered all too clearly what the last one had cost. The newspapers in all these countries in those last days of August 1939 carried headlines about diplomatic negotiations, about ultimatums and deadlines and last-minute meetings, feeding the desperate hope that somehow at the 11th hour the crisis would be resolved as the Sudetenland crisis had been resolved a year before. It was not to be. At 4:45 on the morning of September 1st, the guns began, and the world that had existed in August with all its problems and hopes and ordinary human concerns was gone forever. The first target on Hitler's list was Austria, and the events that unfolded there in early 1938 illustrated with painful clarity how far the international community had travelled from any willingness to enforce the existing European order. Austria, Germany's neighbour and the successor state to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was a country of some 7 million German-speaking people whose incorporation into a Greater Germany had been a goal of pan-German nationalism for decades. The Treaty of Versailles had specifically forbidden such an Anschluss, or union, but as Hitler had already demonstrated with the Rhineland, treaties meant nothing if no one was prepared to enforce them. Austria was not without political complexity. Its own government, led by Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, was authoritarian, dominated by a right-wing Fatherland Front that had suppressed its own socialists and communists in a brief civil war in February 1934, but it was genuine in its desire to maintain Austrian independence from Germany. Schuschnigg was an Austrian patriot in a way that Hitler, despite being born in Austria, most emphatically was not. The Austrian Nazi Party, heavily funded and directed from Berlin, had been agitating for union with Germany for years. An attempted Nazi coup in July 1934 had resulted in the assassination of the previous Austrian Chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss, who was shot and left to bleed to death while the conspirators refused to allow a priest to administer last rites. The coup had ultimately failed, partly because Mussolini had moved Italian troops to the Brenner Pass in a show of opposition that had deterred Hitler from intervening directly. By 1938, however, Mussolini was Hitler's ally, and that restraint was no longer available. The crisis of early 1938 was triggered by Hitler summoning Schuschnigg to his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden on February 12th for what the Austrian Chancellor expected to be a normal diplomatic discussion. What he received instead was hours of barely restrained intimidation. Hitler screamed at him, threatened military intervention, and demanded a series of concessions that amounted to Austria effectively surrendering control of its own affairs to the Nazi movement. Schuschnigg was told to appoint an Austrian Nazi, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, as interior minister, with control over the police. He was to amnesty all imprisoned Austrian Nazis. He was to begin coordination of Austrian and German economic policies. Surrounded by German generals Hitler had pointedly included in the meeting for maximum intimidating effect, Schuschnigg signed the agreement and returned to Vienna with the feeling, as he later wrote, of someone who had shaken hands with the devil. He spent the following weeks trying to find a way out. The answer he settled on was a plebiscite, a direct popular vote in which the Austrian people would be asked whether they wanted to remain independent. He scheduled it for March 13th, 1938. The announcement of the plebiscite threw Hitler into a rage. He had no confidence that a free vote in Austria would produce the result he wanted, and he immediately began planning military intervention to preempt it. On March 11th, he sent Schuschnigg an ultimatum demanding he cancel the plebiscite and resign in favour of Seyss-Inquart. The German military simultaneously began moving troops toward the Austrian border. Schuschnigg went on Austrian radio at 8 o'clock in the evening of March 11th and delivered one of the more moving speeches of the entire crisis, announcing his resignation in the face of German military force, saying that he yielded to violence since he was not willing to shed German blood even in this hour, and signing off with the words, "God save Austria." The following morning, March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the border. There was no resistance. The Austrian army received orders not to fight. German soldiers were greeted in many places by cheering crowds throwing flowers and Nazi salutes. Hitler himself crossed into Austria at his birthplace of Braunau am Inn and drove to Linz, where enormous crowds gathered to see him. He was visibly moved. He had been born in Austria and grown up in Linz. He had dreamed all his life of German unity. Now, in a single weekend, he had achieved it. The formal annexation was announced on March 13th. Austria ceased to exist as an independent state and became the Ostmark, the eastern province of Greater Germany. What were the reactions in Britain and France? Surprise, concern, diplomatic protests, and nothing else. The British Foreign Secretary sent a formal note of protest. The French government, in the middle of one of its recurrent political crises, barely had a functioning cabinet to respond with. The League of Nations, the international organization founded after the First World War precisely to prevent aggressive territorial conquest, did not even hold a meeting on the subject. Mussolini, who had previously blocked Hitler's Austrian ambitions with Italian troops, had now committed to the Axis partnership and watched his own earlier position become irrelevant. There was no military response to the Anschluss from any quarter. When a plebiscite was held in Austria in April under Nazi supervision, approximately 99.7% of voters approved the union. This figure was certainly inflated by the atmosphere of coercion, but genuine popular support for Austrian-German unification was real and substantial, a fact that made international intervention politically difficult to justify, even for leaders who might otherwise have been willing to act. Hitler's reading was simple and unsurprising. He had taken Austria without a single shot being fired, and without any meaningful international consequence. The Western democracies had confirmed his judgment. He turned his attention to his next target. Czechoslovakia was a democratic republic, created by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 from the remnants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a genuinely successful state by the standards of interwar Europe, with a functioning democracy, a thriving industrial economy, and a competent modern army backed by an impressive series of border fortifications along its western, German-facing frontier. Its problem, from Hitler's perspective and also from the perspective of international legitimacy, was that it contained within its borders approximately 3.25 million ethnic Germans, concentrated primarily in the Sudetenland, the ring of territories along its border with Germany that were now, after the Austrian annexation, directly adjacent to the expanded German Reich. The Sudeten Germans were a genuine national minority with genuine grievances, some of them legitimate and some manufactured by a Nazi-directed political movement led by a gymnastics teacher turned political agitator named Konrad Henlein, who was funded directly by Berlin and took his political instructions from the Nazi government. But even if all their grievances had been entirely legitimate, the situation had to be understood in its actual context. Hitler had no interest in the welfare of the Sudeten Germans. He wanted Czechoslovakia destroyed. He had made this explicit in private. In April 1938, he issued a directive to his generals opening with the words, "It is my unalterable will to smash Czechoslovakia by military action in the near future." The Sudeten German question was a pretext, one he was cynical enough to manipulate with considerable skill, but one that served only as a cover for objectives that had nothing to do with minority rights. The Sudetenland crisis dominated European diplomacy from April through September 1938, and the negotiations that followed represent one of the most controversial episodes in modern diplomatic history. The British Prime Minister at the time was Neville Chamberlain, a former Birmingham businessman who had come to politics relatively late, served competently as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and reached the premiership in May 1937 with strong views about foreign policy that were rooted in the conviction that another European war would be an absolute catastrophe. He was right about that. Another war was an absolute catastrophe. Where he was wrong, disastrously wrong, was in his belief that Hitler was a rational statesman whose ambitions could be satisfied through reasonable negotiation and territorial concession. Chamberlain believed personally in the power of face-to-face meetings between leaders, and he decided in the summer of 1938 to take an extraordinary step. He would fly to Germany and meet Hitler directly. He was 69 years old and had never been in an airplane before. He flew to Berchtesgaden on September 15, 1938, to meet Hitler for the first time. The meeting did not go well in any real sense, though Chamberlain left believing he had made progress. Hitler told him bluntly that the Sudetenland had to come to Germany. If it did not come peacefully, he would take it by force. Chamberlain returned to London and consulted with his cabinet and with the French. Together, they agreed to a proposal. The regions of Czechoslovakia where more than 50% of the population was German should be transferred to Germany, and Britain and France would guarantee the remainder of Czechoslovakia's borders. This was offered to Czechoslovakia, which had not been consulted in any of the negotiations, as a take-it-or-leave-it demand. The Czechoslovak government, realizing that without British and French support it faced Germany alone, accepted on September 21st. But when Chamberlain flew back to Germany on September 22nd to present the agreement to Hitler at Godesberg on the Rhine, Hitler had escalated his demands. He now insisted on military occupation of the Sudetenland by October 1st, with no plebiscites, no international commissions, nothing but immediate German military takeover. Even Chamberlain, who had bent over backward to accommodate him, was shaken. He returned to London and told his cabinet that Hitler's demands were unreasonable. Britain and France began military preparations. Czechoslovakia began to mobilize. War seemed genuinely imminent. It was at this point that Mussolini, at British and French urging and with the understanding that Germany would get what it wanted anyway, proposed a four-power conference. Hitler agreed, conscious that he was being given everything he claimed to want, without the need for a military campaign. On September 29, 1938, representatives of Germany, Italy, Britain and France met in Munich at the Führerbau, Hitler's representative building in the city. Czechoslovakia, whose entire future was being decided, was not invited. The negotiations lasted through the night. At approximately 1:30 in the morning of September 30th, the Munich Agreement was signed, providing for the transfer of the Sudetenland to Germany by October 10th. The Czechoslovak representatives, who had been kept waiting in an anteroom, were called in and informed of what had been decided. They were given no choice. Their country's western defences, the fortification line that made Czechoslovakia militarily viable, were gone at a stroke of Chamberlain's pen. Chamberlain then secured Hitler's signature on a separate piece of paper, a joint statement that Germany and Britain had resolved never to go to war with each other again, and would consult together on all questions of mutual concern. He returned to London waving this paper, standing in the wind at Heston Aerodrome, and uttering the phrase that would haunt him forever: "I believe it is peace for our time." Winston Churchill, speaking in the House of Commons, gave the darkest assessment. "We have suffered a total and unmitigated defeat," he said, and described the sacrifice of Czechoslovakia as the beginning, not the end, of Hitler's demands. Events would prove Churchill right with a speed that should have surprised no one who had read Mein Kampf. Adolf Hitler was simultaneously exhilarated and furious after Munich, a paradox that tells you something important about his psychology. He had been given everything he had demanded, but the fact that he had been given it peacefully by diplomatic negotiation gnawed at him. He had wanted war. He had been planning war. The military campaign to destroy Czechoslovakia had been elaborately prepared, and he had been convinced the Western powers would not intervene even if it was carried out by force. The Munich Agreement, by handing him his territorial demands without a fight, had in one sense given him everything and in another sense taken from him the violent, decisive military victory that he believed was essential to Germany's psychological and political reinvigoration. He felt cheated by peace. He said privately that Chamberlain had spoiled his entry into Prague. This was not a man engaged in rational strategic calculation aimed at limited goals. This was a man whose appetite for conquest and destruction could not be satisfied by diplomatic gifts, however generous. In the weeks after Munich, his contempt for the British and French leaders who had capitulated so completely was total. He called Chamberlain a little worm. He referred to the guarantees given at Munich as worthless scraps of paper. He had already decided what his next move would be, and it had nothing to do with the remaining 3 million ethnic Germans in other countries, his officially stated reason for all the previous agitation. But before turning to Czechoslovakia's final fate, events in Germany itself produced an outburst of organised violence that stripped away whatever remaining pretense existed that the Nazi regime was a normal, if authoritarian, government. On the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, the Nazis unleashed a nationwide pogrom against the Jewish population of Germany and Austria that became known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. The immediate pretext was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris, Ernst vom Rath, by a young Polish-Jewish man named Herschel Grynszpan, whose family had been among tens of thousands of Polish Jews deported in appalling conditions from Germany to Poland in October. Goebbels organised the reaction, presenting the violence as a spontaneous uprising of outraged German popular feeling, a lie from the first word. SA men in civilian clothes, organised and deployed by local Nazi Party offices, attacked Jewish synagogues, businesses and homes across Germany and Austria in waves through the night and into the following day. Approximately 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed. At least 267 synagogues were burned to the ground, many while fire brigades stood by under orders not to intervene unless the fires threatened non-Jewish property. Approximately 91 Jews were killed in the violence, with hundreds more dying in the following days from injuries and mistreatment. The number who were murdered in the camps to which they were subsequently taken cannot be precisely established, but was certainly considerable. Perhaps most consequentially, approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, Dachau, Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, where they were subjected to systematic brutality. The camps returned those men who survived after weeks of abuse, on condition that they immediately emigrate from Germany and surrender their property. The message was unambiguous. Jews in Germany had no future, no safety and no rights. They should leave. And those who could were now desperately trying to do so, finding that country after country was unwilling to accept more than token numbers of Jewish refugees. The international reaction to Kristallnacht was one of the most significant moments of moral clarity in the entire pre-war period. Across Britain, America and the democratic world, there was genuine shock and revulsion. The American ambassador to Germany, Hugh Wilson, was recalled to Washington in protest and never returned to his post. Chamberlain himself was visibly affected and told his cabinet that the events of November 9th and 10th had fundamentally altered the political situation in Britain and made public opinion far less sympathetic to further accommodation of Germany. Yet even now, no military response was forthcoming. The Western powers expressed outrage and withdrew their ambassadors for consultation and imposed various symbolic diplomatic measures, but they did not change their fundamental strategic posture toward Germany. Hitler noted this and drew his conclusions. He did not slow his preparations for the next move. The final destruction of Czechoslovakia came with breathtaking speed. After Munich, the Slovaks, encouraged by Germany, had been pressing for greater autonomy within the Czechoslovak state, and by March 1939, the situation had reached crisis point. On March 14th, Hitler summoned the elderly Czechoslovak president Emil Hácha to Berlin for what was presented as a diplomatic meeting and turned into one of the more brutal performances in diplomatic history. Hitler told Hácha that German troops were moving to occupy Bohemia and Moravia, the Czech core of the country, at 6 o'clock the following morning. Hácha could either submit and order his army not to resist, or there would be military conflict, and the destruction of his country's cities from the air would be the result. Hácha, a 66-year-old judge in poor health who had been pulled from bed and flown to Berlin in the middle of the night, was so overwhelmed that he fainted. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's oldest associates, is said to have revived him with an injection administered by Hitler's doctor. Hácha signed the submission document and then called Prague to order the army to stand down. In the early hours of March 15, 1939, German troops crossed into Czechoslovakia without resistance. By afternoon, Hitler himself was in Prague Castle, the ancient seat of Bohemian kings, declaring that Germany had established a protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Slovakia was made a nominally independent puppet state. The Czechoslovak state that had existed since 1919, that had been a genuine democracy, that had been solemnly guaranteed by Britain and France just 6 months earlier at Munich, had ceased to exist. This time, the reaction from Britain and France was different. Not militarily, they still did not fight. But politically, the occupation of Bohemia and Moravia was something qualitatively different from all of Hitler's previous moves. He could no longer claim to be uniting German-speaking peoples who wished to be part of Germany. Bohemia and Moravia were primarily Czech, Slavic peoples whom Nazi racial ideology placed firmly in the category of Untermenschen. He had violated the Munich Agreement, whose ink was barely dry and whose guarantees Britain and France had personally issued. He had broken a specific promise he had made to Chamberlain's face about having no further territorial demands in Europe. Even Chamberlain, who had invested immense personal prestige in the Munich settlement, was now forced to acknowledge that his fundamental judgment about Hitler had been wrong. In a speech in Birmingham on March 17, 1939, he asked, publicly and with evident emotion, whether this was the end of an old adventure, or the beginning of a new one. Was it a step in the direction of an attempt to dominate the world by force? The British cabinet immediately began extending guarantees of military support to other countries believed to be in Hitler's path. On March 31, 1939, Chamberlain announced in the House of Commons that Britain and France would come to the defence of Poland if its independence were threatened. It was a commitment from which it was very difficult to retreat, and it represented the point at which British policy finally acknowledged what Hitler had been demonstrating for years. He could not be appeased. The question was no longer whether there would be a confrontation. It was what Hitler's next target would be and how soon it would come. The answer to both questions was already being determined in Berlin, and the answer would shock even those who had been watching Hitler's moves most closely. Poland had been recreated as an independent state by the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, after more than a century of partition among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. It had been given access to the Baltic Sea through a strip of territory that cut through what had been German Prussia, creating the so-called Polish Corridor, with the historic German city of Danzig established as a free city under League of Nations supervision. These arrangements were sources of deep resentment in Germany, cutting off East Prussia from the rest of Germany and placing a city that was overwhelmingly German by population and culture under international rather than German authority. Hitler had been careful to cultivate good relations with Poland under its military dictator, Józef Piłsudski, signing the 10-year non-aggression pact of January 1934. When Piłsudski died in 1935, Hitler even sent a personal message of condolence that was widely noted as a gesture of genuine respect. After Munich, with Czechoslovakia disposed of, Hitler began signalling to Poland that a new arrangement was needed. In October 1938 and again in January 1939, his foreign minister Ribbentrop raised with the Polish ambassador the question of Danzig's return to Germany and the construction of an extraterritorial motorway and rail connection through the Polish corridor. In return, Germany would offer a 25-year non-aggression guarantee. The Poles said no firmly and consistently. Their own strategic judgment was that acquiescing to German demands, however limited they might initially appear, was the first step on a road that ended in satellite status or conquest. The Polish foreign minister, Józef Beck, told the German ambassador in March 1939 that any attempt to change the status of Danzig by Germany would mean war. Beck was right about what the Germans intended, though he may have miscalculated about how quickly the confrontation would come and how limited the actual Western support for Poland would prove to be in practice. Hitler had already decided by the spring of 1939 that Poland would be his next military target. In April, he issued a secret directive to the German armed forces for Case White, the code name for the military plan to attack Poland, with a completion deadline of September 1, 1939. The challenge he faced was the same one he had faced before Czechoslovakia: how to conduct a military campaign without triggering a general European war with Britain and France. Munich had taught him that the Western powers would not fight for Czech territory. He hoped or calculated they would similarly avoid fighting for Poland. The British guarantee of March 31st complicated this calculation, but he assessed, not entirely without reason given his experience of the past several years, that the guarantee might be empty or might be walked back if he moved quickly enough. More important was a diplomatic masterstroke he was planning that would, if successful, dramatically alter the strategic situation before a single shot was fired. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was the great wild card in European politics. It was the one power that could meaningfully alter the military equation on Germany's eastern flank by putting enough troops in the field to give Germany pause or by providing meaningful support to Poland if war came. The British and French, recognizing this reality however reluctantly, had been conducting negotiations with the Soviet Union through the spring and summer of 1939 for some kind of mutual assistance arrangement. These negotiations were going badly. Stalin was suspicious of Western intentions, believing that Chamberlain would happily arrange a German attack on the Soviet Union and stand aside while the two ideological enemies destroyed each other. There were good reasons for this suspicion. The Western powers had excluded the Soviet Union from the Munich conference entirely, and some British politicians had indeed spoken of Germany as a bulwark against Bolshevism. Stalin was also being offered by Britain and France an arrangement that committed the Soviets to fighting on behalf of countries they had no direct interest in defending. Meanwhile, an approach was developing from a completely unexpected direction that would transform the entire strategic situation in a matter of days. Ribbentrop, on Hitler's instructions, had begun putting out cautious signals to Soviet diplomats in the spring of 1939, suggesting that Nazi Germany and Communist Soviet Union, ideological enemies whose propaganda had been portraying each other as the embodiment of evil for years, might have interests in common. Stalin, ever the cold-blooded calculator, listened. What he was being offered was extraordinary. If Germany and the Soviet Union could reach an agreement, Germany would have its eastern flank secured for the Polish campaign, and the Soviet Union would receive a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, including the eastern half of Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland, without firing a single shot. For Stalin, who had just concluded a disastrously one-sided purge of his own army's officer corps and whose military was in a weakened state, the offer of territorial gains without war, while Germany exhausted itself fighting in the West, was extremely attractive. The negotiations accelerated rapidly in August 1939, with Hitler personally pressing for speed as his September deadline for the Polish campaign approached. On August 22nd, Ribbentrop flew to Moscow, and in the early hours of August 23, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed by the Soviet and German foreign ministers in the Kremlin, while Stalin watched and occasionally interjected suggestions. The public portions of the pact committed Germany and the Soviet Union to 10 years of non-aggression and neutrality. The secret protocol, which was not revealed until after the war, divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence in terms that were unmistakably about dividing the spoils of the conquest that was coming. Poland, east of the rivers Narew, Vistula, and San, would go to the Soviet Union. Poland, west of those rivers, would be Germany's. The Baltic states of Estonia and Latvia would be Soviet. Lithuania would go to Germany but could be exchanged for Soviet compensation later. Finland and Bessarabia were in the Soviet sphere. The news of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact landed on European capitals like a thunderclap. Britain and France had been counting on Soviet pressure to deter Hitler. Suddenly the Soviets were his partners. The Japanese, Germany's nominal allies under the Anti-Comintern Pact, were outraged at what they regarded as a betrayal, their own army having been engaged in fierce border battles with Soviet forces in Mongolia through the summer. Stalin had neatly extricated himself from potential simultaneous threats on both his flanks. Hitler had secured his eastern front and freed himself to deal with Poland, and then, if necessary, the Western powers from a position of far greater strategic strength. When Chamberlain sent Hitler a personal letter after the pact was signed, reaffirming that Britain would stand by its commitment to Poland, Hitler reportedly read it with contempt and threw it on a table. He was going to attack Poland, regardless. The question in his mind was not whether Britain and France would declare war, but how long they would actually fight once Poland fell. He had convinced himself that they would negotiate once Poland was gone. He was wrong about this, but he was right that their practical ability to help Poland in the short term was essentially zero. Poland would be conquered while the British and French mobilized. He did not believe they had the will for a long war. With the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed and the Wehrmacht's preparations for Case White essentially complete, the final days of August 1939 played out as one of the most intense diplomatic dramas in history. A frantic last-ditch attempt by some to prevent war while others were already committed to starting it. Hitler had set August 26th as the original date for the Polish invasion to begin. On August 25th, two events caused him to delay. First, the formal alliance treaty between Britain and Poland was signed in London, transforming the March Guarantee from a political statement into a binding legal commitment. Second, Mussolini informed Hitler that Italy would not be ready to join a war immediately. Italian rearmament was not as advanced as German, and Mussolini asked for an enormous list of military supplies before Italy could enter combat. Hitler was rattled. He postponed the invasion by a few days to see if the diplomatic situation could be resolved, but his orders to his generals made clear he had not given up his intention. He was playing for time, hoping either that Britain and France would back down, or that some face-saving formula could be found that would let him have Poland without triggering the general war he was not yet certain he wanted to risk. What followed was a blizzard of diplomatic activity, proposals, counter-proposals, secret back channels, and dramatic intermediaries that today reads like a badly plotted thriller. Sweden's industrialist, Birger Dalarus, flew between London and Berlin as an unofficial British-German go-between, carrying messages from Göring that neither country's official diplomatic machinery could sanction. Hitler sent demands to Poland through official channels that were deliberately designed to be impossible to accept, requiring a senior Polish representative to appear in Berlin within 24 hours to receive terms that had not been specified in advance. The Poles, who had watched how Hatcher had been humiliated in exactly that kind of meeting just months before, declined. The last direct German-British conversation took place on the evening of August 30th, when Ribbentrop read out to the British ambassador, Sir Neville Henderson, the 16 points Germany was demanding from Poland, but refused to provide a written copy, citing the deadline expiration. It was theatre. Hitler was not interested in negotiation. He was performing the appearance of negotiation for an international audience and for history. He intended to fight. The pretext for war was manufactured in advance with the same careful stage management that had characterized the Nazi approach to every previous crisis. Heinrich Himmler's SS, in coordination with Reinhard Heydrich, the ice-cold chief of the security police, organized a series of false flag operations under the codename Operation Himmler, designed to create the impression that Poland had been the aggressor in a conflict Germany was forced to respond to in self-defense. The most theatrical of these was Operation Gleiwitz, named after the German city on the Polish border, now known as Gliwice in modern-day Poland. On the evening of August 31st, 1939, a team of SS men dressed in Polish uniforms attacked the German radio station at Gliwice, broadcast a brief anti-German message in Polish, left the body of a concentration camp prisoner, a man they had drugged and dressed in a Polish uniform, at the scene as supposed evidence of Polish aggression, and withdrew. A dozen similar staged incidents occurred at other points along the border. Their effect on anyone who took a moment to examine the evidence was essentially zero. The incidents were transparently staged and were not taken seriously by any neutral government or international observer. But that was not their purpose. Their purpose was to give Hitler a talking point for his speech to the German people explaining why Germany was going to war, and to provide German newspapers with something they could print on their front pages. They were propaganda props, and as such they served their function adequately. At 4:45 in the morning on September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border at multiple points along a front that stretched for nearly 1,800 kilometers. The attack came from three directions simultaneously. Army Group North, commanded by General Fedor von Bock, struck from Pomerania and East Prussia in the north. Army Group South, commanded by General Gerd von Rundstedt, advanced from Silesia and Slovakia in the south. The Luftwaffe struck immediately at Polish airfields, communication centres and transportation hubs, attempting to achieve the air superiority that would allow German ground forces to advance without effective air opposition. At sea, the old German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which had been anchored in the Polish port of Danzig on what was described as a courtesy visit, opened fire at 4:47 in the morning on the Polish military garrison at the Westerplatte Peninsula, the first shots of the Second World War. The Polish garrison at Westerplatte, roughly 182 men against a far larger attacking force with naval gunfire support and Luftwaffe bombing, held out for 7 extraordinary days before being forced to surrender. Their commander, Major Henryk Sucharski, was awarded the honour of keeping his sword by the German commander in a gesture of military respect that contrasted sharply with the treatment of Polish civilians that was simultaneously underway. In the first days of the invasion, Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS killing units, followed behind the advancing Wehrmacht and began executing Polish intellectuals, clergy, landowners and Jews in a systematic campaign of terror designed to decapitate Polish society. The German military conquest was the visible war. The SS campaign of terror and murder was the other war, the one Hitler had always intended as his real purpose in Poland. On September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France presented ultimatums to Germany demanding the immediate withdrawal of German forces from Poland. The ultimatums expired without response. At 11 o'clock in the morning on September 3rd, Neville Chamberlain spoke to the British nation on BBC radio in one of the most famous broadcasts in British history. His voice was heavy with exhaustion and what sounded to listeners like genuine personal grief. He said that everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped for, everything he had believed in during his public life had crashed into ruins. Britain was at war with Germany. France declared war a few hours later. The Second World War had begun. On hearing the news that Britain had declared war, Hitler turned to Ribbentrop and reportedly asked, "What now?" It was not, under the circumstances, a reassuring question from a man who had just launched the conflict. Ribbentrop had assured Hitler that Britain would not fight. He had been wrong, but for the immediate future it did not matter greatly. Britain and France declared war but were not yet in a position to fight one meaningfully. The French army was mobilising along the Maginot Line. The British Expeditionary Force was crossing to France. Neither launched any serious offensive action in September 1939, while Poland was being crushed. The so-called Sitzkrieg, or sitting war, on the Western Front in the autumn of 1939 provided bitter confirmation to the Poles that the Western guarantees, while legally fulfilled by the declaration of war, were militarily empty for the time being. Poland fought. It fought with genuine courage and military skill under appalling circumstances, outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting on multiple fronts against a modern military machine employing tactics its doctrine had not anticipated. The myth of Polish cavalry charging German tanks is largely a myth. A few incidents were subsequently exaggerated into legend by Nazi propaganda, but it captures a truth about the disparity in equipment and doctrine between the two armies. Polish armoured and motorised units fought effective delaying actions, and the Polish Air Force, though heavily outnumbered, inflicted greater losses on the Luftwaffe than the Germans had expected. But the mathematics of the situation were inexorable. By September 8th, German forces had reached the outskirts of Warsaw. By September 14th, they had encircled the city. On September 17th, the situation became catastrophic in a way that destroyed the last hope of organized Polish resistance. The Soviet Union, acting on the terms of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded Poland from the east, claiming in a piece of cynical propaganda that it was moving to protect the Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities in eastern Poland, now that the Polish state had ceased to exist. The Red Army met relatively light resistance from Polish forces that had already been committed to fighting Germany in the west, and within weeks, Soviet troops had advanced to the agreed demarcation line. Poland was divided between two totalitarian powers, precisely as Hitler and Stalin had secretly arranged. The Polish government, military commanders, and much of the professional air force managed to escape to Romania and then to Britain, where a government in exile was established and Polish forces would continue fighting on every front of the war for the next 6 years. But Poland as a functioning state had been destroyed in less than 5 weeks. Warsaw held out under siege until September 27, 1939, when the starving and shattered city surrendered to German forces after weeks of aerial and artillery bombardment that killed thousands of civilians and reduced much of the city's architecture to rubble. The last organized Polish military units surrendered on October 6th. The German and Soviet victors partitioned the country between themselves. The general government, the central Polish territories that Germany did not immediately incorporate as German provinces, was placed under the administration of Hans Frank, a Nazi lawyer who would preside over a campaign of terror, exploitation, and eventually mass murder that would kill millions. The SS Einsatzgruppen, following close behind the advancing armies, had already begun the systematic murder of Polish Jews and non-Jewish Poles, of the educated and professional classes, an early warning of the industrial genocide that the Nazi regime would eventually implement across all of occupied Europe. Within weeks of Poland's fall, the Gestapo was arresting Polish university professors and teachers under a program called Intelligenzaktion. Over the following months, tens of thousands of educated Poles were shot or sent to concentration camps in a deliberate attempt to destroy the Polish nation's intellectual leadership. This was not the conventional military occupation of a defeated country. This was the implementation of a racial and ideological program that Hitler had described in Mein Kampf and elaborated in private conversations for years. The question of why the chain of events from 1919 to 1939 unfolded as it did, why Hitler was able to go from a failed putschist in a Munich beer hall to the conqueror of Poland in 16 years, is one historians have been examining ever since. There is no single answer, but there are many factors that together explain how catastrophe became possible. The first was the structural weakness of the Weimar Republic, born in defeat and stigmatized from its first days by the stab in the back mythology and the harsh terms of Versailles. A democratic system that is never fully accepted as legitimate by significant portions of its population is inherently vulnerable. The second was the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, which created the mass unemployment and social despair that gave radical politics a mass audience they would never have found in stable times. The third was Hitler himself, a genuinely unusual political talent whose combination of gifts, the oratorical magnetism, the extraordinary political cunning, the willingness to use violence without restraint or remorse, the absolute unscrupulousness in negotiation, and the ideological fanaticism that gave him a kind of terrible clarity of purpose was historically rare. He was not a normal politician who could be measured against normal politicians. The fourth factor was the failure of the international community, particularly Britain and France, to respond effectively to his moves at the moments when effective response was still possible. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, by Hitler's own subsequent admission, was the moment when a determined French military response would have ended his regime. He did not have the forces to resist. He was bluffing, and no one called the bluff. Each subsequent capitulation reinforced his contempt and diminished the credibility of further warnings. The fifth factor was perhaps the most important and the least discussed: the failure of imagination. Statesmen in London, Paris, Washington, and Geneva looked at Adolf Hitler and could not quite bring themselves to believe that he meant what he said. The contents of Mein Kampf were known, his speeches were available. The pattern of his behaviour from 1933 onward was visible and clear. And yet the conclusion that this was a man who intended to conquer Europe, establish a racial empire in the East, and exterminate the Jews of the continent was simply too enormous, too monstrous, too unprecedented to be accepted by ordinary rational minds. It seemed more plausible to conclude that Hitler was an extreme but ultimately manageable nationalist, driven by grievances that could be addressed, an ally against communism, a phenomenon that would moderate once it had won some of its aims. This failure of imagination was not simply cowardice or stupidity, though it was sometimes both. It was the natural result of minds formed in the 19th century trying to comprehend a phenomenon that had no real precedent. Hitler was something new, and the world's failure to recognize what he was until it was too late cost more than 60 million human lives. There is perhaps no more powerful argument in the entire canon of human history for the importance of taking extremists at their word. The chain of events that produced the Second World War was long and had many links, each one both a consequence of what came before and a cause of what came after. The humiliation of Versailles fed the stab-in-the-back mythology. The mythology provided the emotional fuel for radical nationalism. The radical nationalism found in the Great Depression its mass audience. The mass audience empowered the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party brought Hitler to the Chancellery. The Chancellery gave Hitler control of the state. The state gave him the army, the police, and the industrial economy. The army, police, and economy enabled rearmament. Rearmament made possible aggressive foreign policy. Aggressive foreign policy revealed the West's unwillingness to fight. The West's unwillingness to fight convinced Hitler that further aggression would succeed. The Anschluss, Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia confirmed that conviction at each step. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact removed the last strategic obstacle. And at 4:45 on the morning of September 1st, 1939, all of these threads came together in a single point of catastrophic convergence. The scream of German artillery on the Polish border, the drone of Heinkel bombers over Polish cities, and the beginning of the most destructive conflict in human history. It had taken 20 years to build this moment. It would take 6 more years of almost unimaginable suffering to bring it to an end. 6 years of war would produce some numbers that the human mind struggles to process. Roughly 70 to 85 million people would die, approximately 3% of the entire world population of 1940. The Holocaust would systematically murder 6 million Jews from across Europe, along with hundreds of thousands of Roma, disabled people, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, political prisoners, and others deemed unworthy of life by Nazi ideology. Soviet civilian and military deaths would reach approximately 27 million. China would lose 14 to 20 million. Poland would lose roughly 17% of its entire pre-war population, the highest proportion of any country in the war. Hundreds of thousands of British, American, French, German, Italian, Japanese, and other soldiers, sailors, and airmen would die on every ocean and continent. Entire cities would be reduced to rubble. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would experience something the human race had never seen before. The world that emerged from all of this in 1945 would be fundamentally different from the world that had existed in 1939 in almost every possible way, politically, economically, technologically, morally, and psychologically. And it had all grown, link by link, from a chain of events whose beginning could be traced back to the trenches of 1914, and whose decisive turning point was a series of choices made by one man in Vienna, in Munich, in Berlin, and in the mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden over the course of 2 decades. The secret chain of events that started the Second World War was not secret in the sense of being hidden. Every link was visible to anyone who chose to look. The tragedy is how few chose to look in time. Understanding how Hitler rose to power and how the Second World War began is not simply a historical exercise. It is one of the most important case studies in what happens when democratic institutions are weakened, when economic despair makes populations desperate for simple answers, when extremist movements are underestimated and appeased rather than confronted, and when the rhetoric of leaders is dismissed as mere performance rather than taken seriously as intention. The names and places of the 1930s feel distant, but the dynamics they illustrate are timeless. Democracies can die. Elections can be manipulated, treaties can be broken without consequence if no one is willing to enforce them. and leaders who promise easy solutions to complex problems, who identify scapegoats for national frustrations, who cultivate personal loyalty and demand. Submission to a single will can gain power through democratic means and then destroy democracy itself. These are lessons history has written in the most agonizing possible ink. The hope is that enough people read them carefully enough that the terrible experiment of 1933 to 1939 is never repeated. But hope alone is not sufficient. Vigilance, institutional strength, and the courage to name what you see when you see it are what actually stand between any society and the abyss. Every generation has to choose whether to exercise them. The generation of the 1930s, for the most part, did not, and the consequences were catastrophic beyond the capacity of language to fully express. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that the story of how Adolf Hitler rose to power and how the Second World War began has given you a deeper understanding of one of history's most critical periods. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Germany's field marshals after World War II, where we trace the fates of the very generals whose armies Hitler unleashed on September 1st, 1939. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more WW2 content. See you in the next one.